I've recently tried to discuss this story with my boyfriend, but I don't feel any relief about what happened to me in high school. He tries to explain it away as a group hallucination or someone pulling a prank on my friends and I, but I know deep down what happened was unfortunately real, and it still gives me great anxiety when I think of it. So, the story took place in Lower Alabama when I was in high school, almost 8 years ago, but I still remember every detail like it only happened moments ago. 3 friends and I were making the trip to our other friend's house, way out in the boondocks. We're probably 30 minutes outside of any nearby city or town. There's only one road that takes you to his house, and it's just a long trip of old concrete that's in dire need of repair, but considering only a handful of people live out here, why would the state waste their time and money on it, right? On both sides of the road is just dense forest pretty much that creeps to the edge of the road sometimes. I hardly know where to pull off to. And absolutely no streetlights. So we were in my friend's brand new red Mustang that he got for his birthday, and he was proud to drive us all around wherever he wanted to go. It was him, Jamie, driving, my friend, his name was Dave, in the passenger seat, and myself and my other friend, Mary, crammed into the back seat among his giant sound system. No seatbelts, just sort of half standing, half sitting on the floorboards. And because of this, it was a very uncomfortable ride, and the rattling of the music shook my entire body, but I was just happy that one of us had a vehicle to take us to our buddy's house. We turned onto the long strip of road that would take us there, and was very disappointed that there was another car not too far ahead of us, which meant that Jamie couldn't show off how fast his new car could go. Although there's no crazy turns or curves in the road, it's a solid white line the whole way because of the endless hills. It was still possible to pass someone. We accepted now that we would have to go the speed limit, and Jamie finally turned the music down so that he could talk stuff about the tiny red Toyota that we'd been staring at the back of for about half an hour, I'd say now. But it's about 9 p.m. and there's no moon visible through the dense clouds, so it was pretty much pitch black outside, besides our headlights and the car in front of us with its own lights, which were there bright because I'm sure that they were aware of tons of deer that lived out there. No other vehicles came from the other direction, and nobody was behind us now. We drove for only about 10 minutes, I would say, cutting up and hardly paying attention to the road since we knew where we were going, when suddenly the car in front of us just slams on its brakes, skidding their tires, stopping in the middle of the road. Luckily, Jamie wasn't following too closely, so we didn't have to do the same, but we came to a slow stop maybe 15 feet behind them. There was sort of a brief pause before we then heard a woman screaming at the top of her lungs coming from the Toyota. We had the windows down because some of us had been smoking cigarettes, and that was when we saw it. Now, we had stopped on a declining hill, so we could see in front of the Toyota, and what we saw, I'll never be able to forget. It was some kind of a humanoid-looking creature, standing on all fours, but the arc of its back was taller than the little Toyota. I guess you could say, though, that the only thing that made it humanoid was its hairless skin, but it was really pale, almost grey, very wrinkly, and its limbs were almost impossibly long. What I mean is that its forearm was longer than any human entire arm that I'd ever seen. The legs, the fingers, the arms, the neck, everything just looked like stretched, and we could see all of its bones through its skin too, especially the backbones that were almost spike-like because they jutted out so much. It wasn't facing us, just stopped mid-stride in the middle of the road, facing the right side of the forest. But one of the strangest things was that it had backward-facing knees, like a bird's legs. No tail, but still had the posture of some kind of an animal. I hope to God that it was an animal, but there's no animal here that would be taller than a car on all fours. And like I said, it had sort of human-like skin, hands and feet. Its head was like a human skull too. Anyway, no one in our car said a word, and Jamie instinctually hit the lock button for the doors, though our windows were still down, and the woman in the Toyota was still screaming bloody murder. For a moment, I remember telling myself that it was just some kind of a messed up prank, a weird art sculpture or something, because it was like dead still. But then those thoughts quickly dissipated when this thing cocked its head in our direction, and its face was just as terrible as the rest of its body, pale and wrinkly, just an indentation for a nose, tiny black holes for eyes, no ears, and an impossibly large red-stained mouth that formed into a wicked smile, showing its multiple rows of pointed teeth. The woman's scream instantly grew terribly louder at that moment, and the thing seemed to finally be almost startled by it, turning its head back towards the forest, taking only about 2 giant fluid animal-like steps, and then disappearing into the woods on our right, without one bit of sound. As soon as it was out of sight, Jamie slowly crept the Mustang forward around the still-stopped Toyota, and we saw a man and a woman frantically arguing and crying in the front seats. When we got in front of them, the man puts the Toyota in reverse and goes a bit off-road to turn around and floors it in the direction that we came from. Apparently, where they were headed wasn't important enough anymore. I almost thought that we should do the same, but I just couldn't get myself to make a sound, let alone a word or even a sentence. Jamie went only about 5 miles over the speed limit as he rolled the windows up, and no one said a word for the rest of the 20-minute drive. When we finally got to our friend's house, he was waiting outside for us, waving us as we pulled into the little dirt driveway. All 4 of us scrambled out, pushing past him to get inside the house, and I remember him saying something like, "Whoa, looks like you guys saw a ghost or something." Dave turns to him with the most serious face and says, "Or something, yeah." We got inside, and part of me was still thinking that it was some sort of a hallucination. It must have been, right? Even though we hadn't drank or smoked that day at all, so being the artist of the group, I asked our friend for paper and pencils. Without question, he retrieved them, and while sitting in his living room floor, I suggested that we all try to draw exactly what we saw before we tried to discuss anything. And sure enough, each of us drew the exact same creature and showed it to our friend before explaining the full story. He was horrified and took the drawings out back to a small fire pit and lit them ablaze. None of us protested because, well, quite frankly, we just never wanted a visual of that thing ever again. He asked us things like, had we been drugged or were we pulling a fast one on him, but considering that there were 2 other people that saw the same thing and most of us were to the point of tears, he picked up pretty quickly that we weren't lying. He let us back inside, locked his doors and windows, and put on a movie to distract us, but we just kept bringing it up, trying to make sense out of it, and we didn't get much sleep that night. Jamie took us all home the next day, and on the way we saw the Toyota's black skid marks in the road where it had happened, confirming once more that it wasn't all an elaborate shared dream. And before we dropped off Mary, she told us that she didn't want to hang out with us anymore, simply because being around us would remind her of it. We sort of just nodded, and I honestly haven't spoken to her since then. I rarely speak to the other 2 friends as well anymore, for other reasons, but a few times I've tried to bring it up to them, and they just refuse to talk about it. I know that they know that it happened, though, and it's just too painful for them to discuss, which is understandable because, truthfully, I also hate talking about it to this day, and I've only told 2 of my closest friends, and my now boyfriend, who is very opposed to any supernatural things. So you can probably understand why I didn't get any relief by talking to him about it. Honestly, too, I never really believed in these sorts of things either before this happened, but it's definitely changed my perspective a bit. And please, do let me know if any of you guys have seen anything similar. I've tried researching it, and people keep saying that it's a skinwalker, a rake, or a wendigo, but the descriptions just never fully match up. And I guess I would just like to put a name to whatever that terrible thing that prowls lower Alabama woods was. So this takes place at my childhood home, which sat on the edge of the woods. To separate the woods from the yard, my dad had actually placed large boulders along the tree line. There was also a large mound of dirt from the foundation of the home in the woods. My youngest brother walks with a limp and was rather short and pudgy at this time too. And this is all background and slightly important for the story. So I was about 12 years old when it started. My brothers, Jersey and Joe, their friend Nate and I, we were playing hide and seek around the house. The entire property was fair game, woods included. My youngest brother Joe was it, and me and the two other boys hid behind the dirt mound. We waited there for what must have been 15 minutes and started getting worried because, well, he just never came looking for us. I remember volunteering to find him, and I ran all around that property, but never did find him. I went inside, and he was playing a board game with some other friends. Okay, no big deal, I suppose, but I asked an adult how long he had been inside, and they said that it had been 30 minutes. I ran back outside to tell the others, and when I got to the hiding spot, they were all laughing. They asked how I'd got away from Joe, and I told them that he had been inside the entire time. They stopped laughing and looked at each other, and I asked them what was going on. And it turns out that they saw what they thought was Joe running behind me in the woods as I reached the rocks, and he just disappeared. We saw him around a lot, but kind of ignored it, chalked it up to just kids' imagination, and played in the woods in groups. But a few years later, we had another friend over who had never been to my house. We were all playing inside when he came in the room and asked why Joe was playing in the woods alone. We explained that Joe was actually at a friend's house that day, and there was just no way that it was him. He insisted that it was, though, and that was it. We asked him about the shadow man that we saw sometimes in this place too, but he had no idea what we were talking about. I don't know. That old place was confusing, and the whole thing just still creeps me out. A few years ago, I was 18 years old and heading home from a New Year's party at a friend's house. I had a habit of calling my mum to let her know that I was on my way, but this night my phone ran out of batteries. My friend and I stood at the subway platform when I noticed this older man, maybe in his 40s or 50s, taking pictures of us with his phone and staring quite intently. I kind of brushed it off as him just taking pictures of the crowd on the station, and I just tried to ignore him. A few minutes later, my train arrived, so I said goodbye to my friend, turned on my MP3 player, and grabbed a seat. But then the creepy older guy proceeded to sit down next to me and started trying to make conversation. It started off innocently enough, but quickly resulted in him complimenting my appearance, asking me where I live, or where I'm getting off, etc., etc., in a quite aggressive manner too. He was also texting someone with his phone all throughout it, and I noticed too that his teeth were filed to be more pointy. I'm not talking about just regularly uneven teeth too, but full-on Christopher Walken in Sleepy Hollow type dentistry work. The more I made it obvious to him too that I was uncomfortable and telling him to stop talking to me, the more aggressive he got, and eventually he just told me that I'm going to come home with you. You can try to call the police, it won't matter. I'm coming home with you. I looked around the crowded train, and even though everyone was clearly overhearing this, they just merely rolled their eyes and smiled a bit as if it was some sort of innocuous relationship banter. I held my dead phone in my hand and started thinking about escape routes from the train station to my home, when suddenly the woman opposite me started kicking my leg. At first I thought I was surrounded by crazies, but as the train stopped, several stations before mine, she got up, took me by my arm, and pulled me off the train. Creepy man tried to follow, but the woman kind of pushed him back and the doors closed before he had time to get off. The woman then walked me to a bus that would get me home and told me how she'd been a victim to similar men in the past and she wouldn't let it happen to somebody else. But I'll never forget how a train filled with adults around my parents' age were simply smiling and ignoring my blatant discomfort and potential danger for a good 10 minutes at least. And I will forever be grateful for the woman who finally stepped in and helped me. I do wish that there were more people like her out there. This happened about 7 years ago, but it still really freaks me out. My hometown has a canyon that is rumored to be haunted. The story is that a woman lost her husband in a mining accident, and she haunts the canyon searching for him. In this same canyon there exists a building, very much off the main trail, named the Devil's Playhouse because it's said to be the place where devil worshippers go on satanic holidays in order to do their rituals and whatnot. I was a wannabe ghost hunter and spent a lot of time in that canyon, specifically drawn to the playhouse. It was an old factory with a lot of mysterious writings on the walls and holes into rooms that had no entrance. To get to the factory, you had to drive way off the trail on a very beaten up dirt road, and just after the house there was a fence. As daring as I was, I always turned around at the fence so I could get out of there easily if I got scared. From there, you had to climb in and out of the deep ditch to actually get to the playhouse. But here's what happened that caused me to never go there again. I had brought my younger sister and 2 younger cousins up there one day. We were messing around just taking pictures when my little sister swore that she saw a camera pointed towards us from the rocks outside of the window of the warehouse. I didn't really see it, but my sister was really freaked out. We decided to take a break from the playhouse after this, and we walked about 100 feet to a bunch of large stone fixtures. Now, I had been up that canyon many times, and rarely did I ever see another car, especially at the Devil's Playhouse, but suddenly a truck made its way along the trail. When the driver caught sight of us, he slowed down to probably 5 miles per hour, and the passenger was very noticeably pointing a camera our way. They then proceeded to drive past my car, then back up to it so that we were bumper to bumper, and I really thought that they were going to tow my car or something. They left their truck on, and then the 2 men stepped out and climbed through the ditch. They walked around the far side of the playhouse from us, and my sister pointed out that it was the side the camera was on. I was the adult in this situation, so I was coming up with any reason to give these guys as to why we were there, just in case we were trespassing or something like that. We had walked back to the house to get to the only safe part of the ditch, and as we approached, the man stepped out. They were probably mid-30s or so, and when they did, they didn't say a word. They just stood where we had walked, right past them with no emotion on their faces at all. We made it to my car and drove off, but I had a really sick feeling in my stomach, like they were hiding something up there. And so I decided to park at the base of the entrance of the trail, to the playhouse that is, and just wait for them to come back down. I was stupid, I know, and it was a foolish idea, but I did it anyway. We sat there for a little bit, but after a while, another car pulled up beside us, and the old man who was driving it just stared at us. He was seriously creepy looking too, and it scared the shit out of us, so I drove back down to town, and the whole way, that car followed us. He even parked at the gas station that we went to, and we had gone inside, and he sat in the parking lot for a good 20 minutes before he just left. I'm still not entirely sure what happened up there that day or why, but I have a feeling that there's something hidden up there. I was around 12 years old when this all happened. At the time, I lived in the house that I was at for 3 years, and nothing unusual had ever happened. But one summer at 9:30 p.m, every night on the dot too, I heard knocking on my bedroom window. When it first happened, I just assumed perhaps an animal had hit my window or something. There were no trees anywhere close to my window, so there was no possibility of a tree branch hitting my window or something like that. It soon became hard to keep ignoring it though, and brushing it off as just an animal. I mean, why would an animal hit my window every night at 9:30 on the dot? Also, it was just too distinctly a knocking sound to brush it off as anything but something human. I decided to tell my parents about it whenever it happened, but I suffered from childhood anxiety, so my parents were used to me making a big deal out of sounds, and my dad never found anything outside when he would check. He told me that our backyard, where my window looked out to, was fenced in and no one would be able to climb over the fence, knock, and then leave without anyone noticing. It also didn't help that we lived in a rather large, lit-up neighborhood, so someone would have to see a man coming at every night, 9:30, climbing over a fence and then leaving. So I listened to my dad's reasoning and I tried to ignore it again. But it never stopped. At one stage, I honestly began to wonder if I was going crazy. No one else but me had ever heard the knocking, and there was just no logical explanation, other than an animal of some sorts. I began to think that maybe the knocking was just all in my head. Well, one night I had a friend over. 9:30 hit, and sure enough, there was a knocking at my window. And my friend froze and asked me if I heard that. I told her yes, and that it's been happening every night at the same time for weeks now. I said my dad said that it was an animal, and my friend told me that it sounded too much like a knocking to be an animal though. I agreed, and we told my dad. He checked for us, and sure enough, like every other night, nothing was in our backyard. The knocking continued after my friend had heard it, and one night I had gone to bed at 9, but the knocking was so loud at 9:30 that it actually woke me up. I was freaked out and I ran to my dad in the living room. In order to get to the living room from my bedroom too, you had to pass through the hall, which had a clear window door showing our porch in the backyard. And when I passed this door, I looked outside the backyard, and that was when I saw him. I saw a bright man dressed in a white robe with long blonde hair running through my backyard. But when he reached the middle of my backyard, he just disappeared. This scared me even more, and I went to my dad sobbing that I saw a man and he was knocking on my window. My dad checked outside again, and there was just nothing there. He tried to comfort me and said that it was probably some light reflection that I had seen. He calmed me down and told me that if I saw a man again to go and get him. And then I just went back to bed. The strange thing is, though, is that after that encounter, the knocking just stopped completely. I'm 20 now and I still live in that house, and I haven't seen or heard anything since that night when I saw the knocking man. So this story takes place in Cincinnati, Ohio, specifically Clermont County. So I'm a female, I'm 31 years young now, and this happened in 2006, so at the time I was 17 going on 18. Now my boyfriend, we'll call him M, and my friend we'll call A, and her boyfriend, our husband, we'll call N, are the ones involved in this unexplained event. For some background first, there's this abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods, and you can only get to it by walking about a mile one way. There are some abandoned cars, and an ambulance, some tractors, and other random vehicles like a short school bus, and they're all covered in gunshots. There's not even a path to drive a vehicle back there, so we would be walking a mile one way to get there, so we're not sure how they could have even got there or how long they would have been there, but my boyfriend and I had gone with 2 other friends previous to our encounter, and it was creepy, but not compared to what happened when we went with A and N. So on our previous trip, we went with our friends T and J. T and myself went upstairs and had a Ouija board. We just asked some random stupid questions that I can't even remember now, but what I do remember is that it spelled out hooey. We said goodbye on the board, and we were just looking around the upstairs, which was really just an attic. But we found massive kid socks in the wall, and it was really random and kind of weird. We got pretty startled too when an alarm clock just started ticking. It wouldn't stop as well, so I smashed it to pieces, and that was that. We walked back downstairs where the boys were, and we made our way back outside. We also found a creepy well that was covered up, and then all of a sudden we heard that alarm clock just start ticking again, but I knew that I had broken it, so that kind of spooked us, but it was nothing too major. We saw an outdoor cellar that we went into, and there was a girl's child boot with a bone inside the shoe, so I was like, okay, we're done for today, let's get out of here. And my boyfriend and myself were telling A and N about this cabin and what happened when T and J came with us that time. And so we decided that we were going to go later that day again. The day the encounter happened, M, N, and A and myself went to the lake, packed a cooler with food and crap, and spent probably 5 hours or so at the lake and ate and just kind of hung out. We left the lake and stopped at A and N's house, dropped the cooler off, which was in the trunk of the car. This is important for later as well in the story. And after getting everything out of the trunk from our lake trip, we headed to my boyfriend's parents' house where we parked the car and began our hour-long walk. We had some flashlights, but that was about it. The walk there was pretty uneventful as well. We have to walk through 2 huge drainage tunnels to get to this cabin as well. But we make it there, and it wasn't dark out, but it seemed just different this time. I'm not sure how to really explain it, but it was just different. But we had come later in the day than previously, so I just kind of put it down to that and was like, okay, whatever. Just like last time when we got inside, A and myself were going to go upstairs. I wanted to show her the socks in the wall, and I also wanted to check out that clock that I broke last visit that I heard ticking outside previously again. But as we start to go up the stairs, there was a big crash, like someone was thrown or knocked over. A gets freaked out, and then out of nowhere, she just books it outside back down the creek, yelling at M and N and myself to come on. I go chasing after her, and she's in tears, having a full-blown panic attack, saying something. Finally, I get what she saw. She said that she saw someone looking at the window at us. We tell the guys, and literally, nobody is around. Only the 4 of us. Since she's so distraught, though, we decide to just go ahead and we leave. So as we're walking back down the creek bed, heading back the same way that we came, which is the only way there, M and N are kicking over these huge rocks. We stop and we realize that there are huge rocks, and I'd say boulders, standing right up in the line the entire way down the creek bed. And they just couldn't have been there. I mean, they were not there even just 20 minutes prior, because we would have noticed them, because they were huge. So this definitely started to freak us out a bit. This wasn't normal, and this was pretty unnatural, so we picked up the pace and we started to haul ass out of there. Well, we make it to the first drainage tunnel and we turn on our flashlights, and literally none of them will turn on. 4 flashlights that worked perfectly fine on the way there, and now none of them will turn on. And it was at this point that I was like, what the hell is happening? But 30 minutes later, we're back at my boyfriend's parents' house where A&N's car is parked. A gets in the car because at this point, she's ready to just get the hell home and forget this event ever happened. The rest of us are still outside the car, when A suddenly gets out of the car screaming and jumping up and down and flaying around. We get a closer look at her and she is absolutely covered in ants. We're like, what the hell is going on here? So we look and they're coming from the back seat from the trunk. Anne opens the trunk of his car, and there, laying in the trunk, is this huge, rusty, extremely old woolly sock just covered in ants. Now, remember what I said earlier in the story? We had been in and out of the trunk all day long, and I can affirm that there was nothing in the trunk when we left their house from dropping off the cooler. But now, there's this huge woolly sock just covered in ants in the car. This was obviously just way too much for any of us to even wrap our heads around. So, needless to say, we never went back there, and I personally will never be going back there again. But I did find out later that it turns out that the man who used to live in that cabin was actually named Hubert, and he was often called Huey. My boyfriend had actually been to the cabin once before I ever went, and he found these journals there too. And the man was an alleged child molester. His journals too went into detail about all of his urges and all that stuff. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it was disturbing to say the least. But again, this is honestly the one and only time that I've ever encountered something like this. I'll never be going back to that cabin, ever. Even to this day, just talking about it, and even right now, I just have goosebumps. I can't explain what happened that day, and I have no idea what I saw that scared her so bad in that window, but I do know that boulders do not stand straight up on their own like that in a line, and nobody could have done it so fast to scare us like that. And also, nobody could have messed with our 4 flashlights, and nobody could have put that old dirty ant-infested woolen sock in A&N's car trunk. I know that this is a bit of a weird story, but if you're ever wandering around my neck of the woods and come across a random cabin, please, just leave it alone. You never know who lived there and what they did and who or what may still be there. And unfortunately, I learned that the very hard and unsettling way.